So that was the magic bell. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this seminar about the EU chemical strategy for sustainability with a focus on mixtures. My name is Daniel Slunge. I'm a researcher and policy coordinator at FRAM. FRAM is the Center for Future Chemical Risk Assessment and Management at the University of Gothenburg. I will moderate this seminar in collaboration with Åsa Arrhenius, who is the FRAM coordinator. We have an interesting seminar in front of us with 4 presenters that I will introduce as we go along. We will welcome questions during the seminar via the chat function. So you can just post your questions or comments in the chat, and I will post them to the presenters. First, at the end of each presentation, there will be a very short time for some comments or questions, and then in the longer discussion we have at the end of the seminar. As you have seen, we are filming this seminar, and we will hopefully post it on our YouTube channel afterwards. Okay, so please keep your microphones unmuted while we go along here, and if there are any questions, you can post them in the chat. Åsa, is there anything more I should say as an introduction?
No, but please keep your phones muted during the presentation. And keep your videos off for the recording. That will be less data in there. And I will also inform all speakers when there is 1 minute left, and I have Daniel to keep track of the chat, but most welcome to everyone.
Yeah, it's great also to see so many participants here. This strategy was that we're going to discuss today was presented in October by the Commission, and one of the staff at the Commission who was has been working in the development of this strategy is our first presenter today. It's Mr. Boije of Gennäs, who is staff at the Swedish Chemicals Agency, but has for several years been seconded as a national expert to the European Commission. So Urban will give a slightly longer presentation than the other presenters in order also for us to get an overview of what this strategy is about. So welcome, Urban.
Thank you. So I will start to share my screen now. Let's see. So do you see?
It's fine.
Let's see, but the problem is that. Okay, so yes, I'm Urban Boije. I was for 6 years seconded to the European Commission DG Environment and worked with the preparations of this strategy. And I also worked lately, in particular, with the mixtures in relation to the strategy. I will try to run through the strategy to give an overview, trying to make sure that I don't spend too much time on this, so I can also go into the particular parts that relates more to mixtures. Let's start and see. So a short background. It was 20 years ago since we had the last chemicals strategy, which was presented in the white paper on the strategy for future chemicals policy that was the starting point of the development of REACH, basically. The background of this particular strategy started already in the 7th Environment Action Programme, which was adopted in 2013, where it's said that the Commission should develop a strategy by 2018, and obviously it ran a little bit late. late last year in December 2019, the Commission presented the communication on the European Green Deal, and there it was set out that there should be a strategy, and also some overall priorities were mentioned there, among them mixtures, by the way. And in the end, the strategy was the chemical strategy for sustainability towards a toxic-free environment was in the end adopted and published on the 14th of October this year. And by the way, the time during the last commission where there was no official process to develop any strategy, instead the commission undertook a number of policy evaluations, which are listed here. And you could say that those are the basis for the strategy. So the strategy draws on these policy evaluations to a large extent. And of course, it's then rather well underpinned through these. Then I should also tell you that together with the strategy, a number of supporting or background documents were presented, among them 4 staff working documents, and one of those is dedicated to mixtures. And this gives a factual background and an idea of the state of the science and the development during the last decades on mixtures. So this strategy includes vision for the future, and I would say that the logics or the idea behind this vision is to be more proactive and preventive than current chemicals policy, to move in this direction, to be more proactive and preventive. And in this way, try to avoid problems, exposure, pollution, but before it occurs to a larger extent, rather than spending time trying to clean up or stop already occurring exposure. And this is supposed to be achieved through supporting innovation on new, safe and sustainable chemicals that can be alternatives to current chemicals and a basis for a substitution, but also to strengthen the legislation and the implementation of the legislation. Then you have also processes around the cooperation and sharing of data in the context of chemicals risk assessment and during the implementation process of the legislation, to continue to build the knowledge base on chemicals in different ways, and also to be active on the global scene in the international cooperations of different kinds, bilateral and multilateral. The strategy includes something like 56 concrete actions with the deadlines, and the easiest way to find these is to look at in the annex of the they are presented in the core strategy itself in boxes, but there is also an annex to the strategy where the actions are set out together with the deadlines. So you could say that the strategy contains 5 main building blocks or areas of actions, and I will try to run through these and try not to get stuck on the details. So the first one, as I mentioned, support to research and development innovation on safe and sustainable by design chemicals. And the idea here is also that you need to start with defining what properties these kind of chemicals should have. So you have a common idea of this, and you know what is supposed to be supported. Then there are other kinds of support measures, both financing, but also building of networks and cooperating with the value chains. Non-toxic material cycles is also part of the strategy. And this includes, for example, improving the information and tracking of chemicals in products and in also through the whole process to recycled materials and their use. There are also some parts that are related to development of more sustainable chemicals in more general terms, also including other sustainability aspects like carbon emissions and probably feedstock and these kind of things. And a part that is about strategic autonomy, which is basically to make sure that you have a supply of critical chemicals within the EU. Then I would say that the part about the stronger legislation is maybe the core part of the strategy. Here you have the ambition to apply a more generic approach to, in particular, substances of very high concern and the likes of these. Here you want to have more of group-wise restrictions, broader restrictions with a possibility of derogation, and also the protection of children and consumers in general, but also professional users are mentioned in this area to improve the protection. It's also the concept of essential uses is mentioned here. And the idea would be that in certain cases you would have a broader ban, but allow essential uses. Then it remains to define what you mean by essential uses, which is not defined for chemicals legislation today. The concept of essential uses is used in the Montreal Protocol, though. There are special measures with regard to endocrine disruptors, which is about, for example, establishing horizontal criteria for the identification of endocrine disruptors, and also to include endocrine disruptors in the concept of substances of very high concern under REACH. Then there is a particular part dedicated to mixtures. I won't go into this, but I will hopefully have time to come back to it later during the presentation. There is also chemicals pollution harmful to the natural environment, and this pinpoints substances of particular interest to the environment, and among them substances that are very persistent and very mobile. And on that note, there is also a particular part on PFAS, where you, in this case, want to have a quite general ban of the use of PFAS with the possibility of derogation for sustainable uses. There are also other aspects like research and innovation on alternatives and substitutes, and also remediation measures for PFAS. On the simplification and consolidation of the legal framework, there is a label they use here, one substance, one assessment. And the idea behind this is to improve the risk assessment process across legislations, but also improve the cooperation between authorities and scientific bodies involved in the risk assessment, and also improve the sharing of data between these bodies. And there are also some actions set out that has to do with simplifying this sharing of data, to set up a common data platform to enable the sharing of data, and also to facilitate the use of academic data in risk assessment. In this part of the strategy, there is also a part about enforcement, basically. One part is to improve the compliance of the REACH registration dossiers, and also to have possibility of stronger measures when there is no non-compliance, to withdraw the registration numbers for substances, for example. But there are also measures related to the enforcement work in the member states here, with a particular focus on e-trade, for example. There is also, as I mentioned before, the continued building of the knowledge base on chemicals, which basically includes two different parts. One is to improve information requirements on chemicals by adding new categories of chemicals, which includes low volume chemicals, but also polymers, for example, and to also have information requirements for new endpoints like immuno and neurotoxic substances. Then there is a part which has to do with strengthening research on chemicals by having a more comprehensive and long-term research agenda for chemicals, for example. This part also includes some things like the setup of an EU early warning system, and to develop a set of indicators to follow the development in the chemicals area, in the chemicals policy area. And finally, there is a global part. One of them is to be active in and take leadership in international conventions on chemicals, but also other processes like the IKEM process, where one task is to adopt a new global goal for chemicals after the current one that runs until 2020. This is already an ongoing process. Also,
you now have 1 minute left.
Okay. Also, OECD cooperation is mentioned here. I will then skip and go to the parts about mixtures. I will probably be a little bit overdue here, take a little bit more time. So there are a number of specific actions on mixtures. The first one is to introduce a mixture assessment factor or factors under REACH for the taking account of mixtures. The other one is to introduce legal provisions in the different pieces of chemicals legislation where this currently is missing. So those are the actions set out in the box in the strategy. They also mention some other aspects which are not in the box among these actions, and this is to continue the development of methodologies to assess mixtures basically in the pesticides related legislations where there has been ongoing development work of methodologies for a long time already, and they are still not finalized. Some of them are more ahead of the others. The other one is the mentioning of the possibility to develop targeted methodologies in particular areas, in particular pieces, under particular pieces of legislation or areas of use. Then I would say that of course there are other actions in the strategy that has a connection to mixtures, as mixtures is so broad and it goes across all chemicals related problems or policy problems, I would say. So in the strengthening of the legislation with the generic approach and the grouping approaches that the strategy is trying to strengthen, this of course has implications for mixtures as well. Also the one substance, one assessment with improving the possibilities to cooperate in another way across legislation would be important or could be important to address mixtures. And then I would also say that the idea is to open legislations like REACH and CLP as targeted as possible to introduce the necessary measures to improve, for example, the assessment of mixtures. So I have to stop there because
Urban, thanks a lot for this overview. There is not any questions so far in the chat, so please take your two last slides about mixtures also. I think it's important that we get that part also.
Okay, let's see. Well, this is according to what DG Environment's Chemicals Unit know now about next steps, and that there will be a roadmap or for a inception impact assessment of the revisions of the REACH that they want to do, and this would include the introduction of the mixture assessment factor. And they will also launch a study, and they are already preparing the terms of reference for this study now, so it should be launched. I guess it will take into next year before they will be able to finalize the procurement process for this study. And there will be also possibilities to provide input, because there will be open public consultation probably of the impact assessment work here. Well, I would say that what is missing or less clear regarding mixtures in the strategy is that you have the idea of an impact assessment factor. This is currently limited to REACH. It's not said that it should be applied in other legislations or other areas of use not covered by REACH, for example. There is still no legal mechanism to manage mixtures that goes across different pieces of legislation or areas of use. You have possibilities maybe to develop something cross legislation in this one substance, one assessment work, for example. Then I would say that in general, in the strategy, pesticides, biocides, and pharmaceuticals are rather absent, or it's mentioned maybe, but not very much. And there are few concrete actions that relate to these legislations or areas of use, which is of course a problem in relation to mixtures, as these kind of chemicals are also often important in mixtures. Altogether, the concrete actions are limited to REACH. Other pieces of legislation are mentioned, but in a much more overall way. The possibility of introducing legal requirements in other pieces of legislation is mentioned, but it's not quite clear what this process will look like. Okay. I think I finished.
Thanks a lot, Urban, for this overview. Very nice starting point of this seminar. One quick question to you, posed here by Pedro Inostroza, is, does this strategy cover also products and chemicals imported to the EU?
Yes, I would. I mean, of course, when it comes to single chemicals or chemical mixtures, intentional mixtures, they are covered by the chemicals legislation. The problem is more the import of chemicals in the form of products or articles, as it's called in REACH. And this is part of the strategy, definitely, and it's mentioned as a problem also to manage imported articles. I would say that regarding actions, it's this is one area where the strategy is not very clear. It refers to a large extent to the work done under the action plan for circular economy, where there is a sustainable products initiative being developed, which is supposed to deal with some aspects, some problems related to chemicals in articles. But I have a feeling that here things might or could fall between the cracks of the circular economy, waste policy, and the chemicals policy still. So this is an area to keep an eye on, so to say.
Okay, thanks a lot. We can get back to that and other issues in the discussion. So we'll move on. The next presenter is Ms. Kristina Neimert Carne, who is the head of chemicals policy at IKEM, the Innovation and Chemical Industries in Sweden. So we are, of course, interested in how industry views this strategy. What do you think are the strengths and weaknesses or missing pieces, and not least in particular to the dealing with chemical mixtures? So welcome, Kristina.
Thank you. I hope that you all see my screen now, which should mention IKEM.
Yes, we do.
Yeah, that's good. That's great. Thank you for having me. I just let you briefly know what IKEM is. IKEM is a business organization. It's the Innovation and Chemical Industries in Sweden. So it's the business organization for chemical industry from Sweden. We have approximately 1,400 company members, and though they have approximately 60,000 employees in Sweden. And these are companies working with chemistry in a rather broad fashion. So we have everything from pharmaceutical industry to plastic companies to chemical producer and also oil refineries. But moving on to the strategy then, I mean, chemistry play a fundamental role in most or all our activities. Chemistry is the basis for everything that we know, that we use, that we are. And the chemical industry is fundamental in that sense, that it delivers to each and every other industry, since chemicals are used in production to create new materials, to ensure safe food production. It saves lives with pharmaceuticals. We produce hand disinfectants, we produce soaps, we produce detergents. So we need chemicals to fight COVID-19. We need chemicals for the modern way of life that we know today. And also for the more sustainable way of life that we actually strive for. So we really need chemicals to produce batteries, to produce solar panels, to produce wind turbines. We use large amounts of chemicals today, and we know that we will use even more chemicals tomorrow. So with that in mind, we are very, very happy actually that the Commission has recognized the essential use of chemicals in this strategy. And as a whole, we think that the strategy is very good, and we really welcome it. There are initiatives on research, on development, and on innovation in this strategy that we really, really welcome. We know that there are problematic chemicals on the market, and that we actually need to substitute these and remove those from the market. But although innovation has actually not waited for this strategy to happen, companies react to consumer needs every day. Innovation usually starts with your own customers. Customer trends are already today reflected on business strategies among all our members. And we are really happy that the Commission also points at the uniform definition of safe and sustainable by design in order for us to develop new and sustainable and better chemicals without compromising on sustainability and without having different definitions of what is sustainable. We have for many years pointed at a uniform implementation, the need for uniform implementation and enforcement of chemical legislation in all member states, as well as on the EU borders. I mean, of all the chemicals that are non-conforming on the EU market today, more than 90% actually originate from countries outside of the EU. So this is a very important important priority that we also see that the Commission has in this strategy. And we believe that if we implement this strategy well, this can be a very, very good opportunity, both for the industry and for the Green Deal vision of climate neutrality in 2050. As I said, this chemical strategy for sustainability, it is an opportunity to accelerate the Green Deal vision, but we need incentives. This strategy comes with a lot of challenges. And as I said, it is important to remind ourselves that this chemical strategy, it was set up as a key pillar of the European Green Deal. And this Green Deal was presented as a growth strategy, where environmental, economic, and social sustainability should go hand in hand with addressing all these policy issues that have been left uncoordinated for way too long. And However, then, despite this massive number of components in this strategy and the very broad scope, we believe that the Commission has missed a bit on the connection to this Green Deal. We had expected this to be more of a growth strategy, but we missed the clear incentives that the industry actually needs to invest in research, in development, and in green production. I mean, regulatory predictability, it is a key component for investments. It's not the only one, but it's a very, very important one. The strategy do acknowledge the indispensable role of the EU chemical industry, but it lacks the ambition to drive the massive amount of investments. What I'm talking about are all those investments for innovation that is required to drive the Green Deal objectives like climate neutrality, sustainable chemistry, circularity, digitalization, and of course, a cleaner Europe, which is something that we all want. And these suggestions, there are suggestions in the strategy, but they are presented a bit vague. We don't really see, sorry.
Now you also have 1 minute left, Kristina.
Okay, we don't see the key value chains and dependencies on those value chain. And that is the kind of information that we need to know in order to define business strategies. So what do we need then, and where do we start? Well, this strategy points at a large number of regulatory proposals. None is really new. Many have been discussed for several years and are very much needed. And there is a broad agreement that chemicals must be used and produced safely. The most tricky question is maybe not whether certain chemicals need to be phased out or not. What is more difficult, and what is only briefly mentioned in this strategy, is actually how we determine which properties the chemical compounds have, or rather not have. I mean, this is our biggest challenge today, and this will be also our challenge tomorrow as well, unless we really put efforts into finding new, better, more efficient tools to predict chemical risks. I mean, there are no chemical companies that want to invest in new chemicals that after years of development turn out to have unwanted properties. It might take 2 years for an animal study to show results, and that is way too long. And innovation cannot be limited to substituting certain classes of chemicals. It must be much broader than that. And we hope that the strategy will simply not only focus on chemical risks. Innovation is all about integrating new societal trends. And this is also really needed from this strategy. And I mean, lastly, I want to point out how important it is to see this strategy in a holistic way in order to ensure that chemicals are used and produced in Europe and contribute to sustainable solutions. We need to integrate chemical safety with resource efficiency, energy use, land use, and much more. We want to move to climate neutrality. We want to move to circular economy. We need chemical recycling to complement mechanical recycling. We need high performance materials that actually meet the sustainability criteria. We need to integrate all that. And for that, we need a massive amount of funding, but also methodologies, new mechanisms to help investors to determine what is sustainable by design. I mean, we have a very good starting point in this strategy, and implementation of this strategy requires cooperation and coordination between industry, authorities, academia, civil society, and politicians. But it also requires cooperation between authorities involved in chemical safety, circular economy, climate neutrality. And I really hope that Sweden will take a leading role and a responsibility for all parts of this strategy and not only focus on the regulatory parts.
Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot, Kristina, for this presentation. I have one question for you, and that concerns the mixture allocation factor that is a part of the strategy. Does your organization and industry in Europe generally welcome this idea, or how do you view this?
I mean, I think the important thing is that the basics is that we share the overarching goal that chemicals shall be produced and used safely, and they should not cause any harm to the environment. And as I just said, I think for this strategy to be successful, it needs to be treated as a whole strategy. And in that case, I think it's a bit difficult to take out one pick one regulatory policy suggestion and discuss exactly how this should be implemented or not to target this overarching goal. I mean, if a mixture assessment factor is needed in order to use and to handle chemicals safely, I think it's a very important important tool. That is not the question. The question is how we are going to implement it. Are we going to implement it the same factor for all different chemicals, or are we going to implement it differently for different chemicals? I think that is what is the difficult question. And unfortunately, I don't have a good answer to that. But I know that the companies are working quite hard to provide information and data to the Commission in order to actually make this assessments that Urban was talking about. So we really look forward continue working and discussing this.
Okay, thanks a lot. So now we will move on with the third presentation, and that is Dr. Anna Lennquist, who is a toxicologist working with chemical substitution and other issues at the Chemical Secretariat, CHEMSEC, also based here in Europe, in Gothenburg, working in Europe. So welcome, Anna. And please unmute.
I'm sorry, I didn't find the unmute button, but now I'm here.
Welcome.
Thank you very much, Daniel, and thank you, Kristina, for the great introduction from your side, and also Urban. I work for an environmental organization, and we'll try to give that perspective, an environmental organization focusing much on REACH and chemicals policy, and also on in a lot of dialogue with progressive companies that are often far ahead of regulation. There you go. But I would like to start off by pointing out the urgency of the issue that the chemical strategy is to tackle. And I think that's an important starting point. And this picture is also from the publication of the chemical strategy. We have a chemical production that, just as Kristina said, has doubled in recent years and is expected to double again until I think 2030, 2040 something. It's an extensive industry. It's the second largest industry in requiring energy, feedstocks mainly oil and natural gas. And there is a huge lack of knowledge of the chemicals, which was also said that it is difficult to find. It takes time to know the properties of the chemicals, but there is a big problem that the production of new chemicals is so much quicker than the knowledge generation of what properties they have. So this picture shows a little bit of the amount of chemicals that we don't know anything about. And we also know that there are hundreds of man-made chemicals in the blood of each and every one of us all around the world. We know that they can be linked to a number of health effects, such as infertility, cancers, and others. We also know that they are linked to biodiversity loss if we are looking at the natural environment. And we also know that a main part of the European population is worried about the presence of hazardous chemicals in consumer products, both for their health and also for environment. So we welcome very much the chemical strategy because we think it's a nice document that addresses really the urgency in a new way and in a step forward from the REACH regulation and what was done there more than 10 years ago. I think it covers very important key areas that had not been addressed well before. It's extremely ambitious in terms of the timed targets. It's also nice that it focuses much on implementation. Also, as Kristina said, we know that 90% of the illegal chemicals that are found when governments are measuring products, for example, come from imported articles. And we know that even if European companies are doing their homework, we are getting things into the European Union through import. We also know that the companies that are doing their homework are not so well rewarded because other ones can just continue using hazardous chemicals that are banned because the implementation is so weak and the enforcement of the regulation. So I'm very glad to see that there is a focus also on that in the chemical strategy so that the regulations that are taken are really also happening and that people cannot get away with not following that. It's also very nice to see that there are cleared and timed actions, those 56, and very ambitious and in quite a short time actually. And when it comes to the things we particularly like, it's this toxic-free hierarchy that also Urban showed us on his picture. It's a new way of addressing chemicals in the sense that it says that the most hazardous chemicals should be substituted and not used at all, except for essential uses. So it's not about making advanced risk assessment calculations to be able to say that, yes, we can still use this because there is no risk. But for the most hazardous ones, they should be substituted without doing this thorough risk assessment calculations. And because we simply do not want them in society unless for essential uses. And I think that's a really important point to drive the development and to really come forward with this problem of the hazardous chemicals that we still have all around us. Another important thing is that there will be new hazard categories acknowledged also in the classification and labeling regulation. For example, endocrine disrupting chemicals, which we have been discussing for ages, the urgency of that. And I think that a proper classification and labeling will help everyone to know what chemicals those are and how to avoid them. We also address mobile chemicals, which is also a bit of a new category, chemicals that are persistent but also mobile in the environment rather than bioaccumulative. And I think that's really important. And it's also said, which can be both scary and also good, that there should be a joint hazard identification across regulations so that you do not do an evaluation for food and then you do another one for consumer products and industrial chemicals, for example. But a hazardous chemical is a hazardous chemical no matter the application or the use of it. So I also welcome that. There is also something about the circular economy in there, which is a really important transition for society that we are going through. There have been some confusion and some misperception about that the recycling targets and the non-toxic environment targets are apparently contradictory. And I think it's important that the chemical strategy states that we need to have the same requirements for recycled material as we do for virgins. We cannot continue to circulate toxic chemicals in the loop, even though we are all striving for more recycling and for more, for more recycling and for more circularity. And an important key point in that is, of course, transparency. We need to know better what we have in the materials that are in use today to know how we can use them tomorrow.
1 minute left, Anna.
Woo. And another important thing is about market transition, where it's said that the chemical strategy should reward frontrunners, and that we also need this definition of safe and sustainable chemicals. And I think it's interesting that the chemical strategy does not see the industry as one thing that we need to protect, but that there is a difference between companies that are developing alternatives, that are progressive, that are going in the direction of sustainable society, and that those should be rewarded for that, and that there is a clear direction within the industry. And finally, going into the topic of today, I'm very glad to see that unintentional mixtures are addressed, because this has been an important gap in regulation since a long time. It has been acknowledged for a very long time that this is a big problem, that we are not exposed to chemicals one by one, but in a mixture from that is very difficult to predict, that is from everything, and that is not intentional. And we know from recent research programs that there is a concern at real life scenarios of real life mixtures that we are exposed to, especially among, for reproduction and development, pregnant women, small children. And we also know that we cannot tackle this case by case. We cannot predict every mixture in every situation, but we need to do this somehow pragmatic and effective. And therefore, I think it's really nice that the chemical strategy has mentioned this mixture allocation or mixture assessment factor, and the concept of the risk cup, which means that we cannot sort of fill up the risk cup for each individual chemical. We cannot have a safe level of each individual chemical, but we need to see them together, the combined exposure of all of these. And in short, I know we will discuss this very soon, but I cannot see a scientific reason to have different maths, because that's still an estimation, that is still a pragmatic approach. And it needs to be science guided, of course, but in the end, it will be a policy decision, the exact size of that to be protective enough. And the final text in italics here is what is said in the chemical strategy, that there will be an assessment of how to introduce this factor first in the REACH regulation, and quite soon, as you see. Daniel asked us to not be only rosy about the strategy, but actually I am quite rosy. I got almost goosebumps when we read it in October. But of course, there's a lot of things. It's very ambitious, it's short times, and it's a lot of stakeholders that will come together. And those definitions, for example, safe and sustainable chemicals and essential use, to get them right and to get them protective is, of course, really, really important. And a lot can happen there still. Also, we are talking about opening the REACH regulation, which is scary, I think everybody thinks, because everybody has gone quite used to it and quite happy. So what will happen when we open it? And I'm also worried about the amounts of impact assessment that will be done to see how industry will cope with this transition and what kind of impacts it will have. And I think actually it's a bit sad, but we cannot save every industry and in the same time save human health and the environment. But we need to focus on the progressive ones to get this transition and to really take the problem for what it is. And thereby I finish.
Thank you, Anna. Very nice presentation. There are two questions in the chat. I will only pose one to you, because the question about the MAF, and maybe some people even don't, I will ask the next presenter actually to say a bit more what a mixture assessment factor can be, and so on. So we'll wait with the question from Karel on how that can be applied, and also for the discussion. But there is a question from Diana Schettström on how front runners in using safer chemicals can be rewarded.
It's a huge topic, of course, but one example where it has failed, we see in the REACH regulation, where you can get authorization for continued use of a very hazardous chemical. And unfortunately, many alternative producers feel that they are not listened to, because in the end, the companies are still getting authorization for continued use of a hazardous chemical, even if another one is producing an alternative. And thereby, the alternative producers are are losing that investment and that innovation. So I think one important part is to not do like that, but to rather do the opposite, to listen more to the alternative producers. Then it's also promised things like funding for innovation, and I think that's also important. But I think also that implementing the regulation that is already there and ensure that that companies cannot escape that one is also, of course, rewarding the ones that do follow the regulation.
Thank you, Anna.
Yeah, thanks everybody for joining, for investing the time, especially thanks to the previous presenters. That also gives me a bit of the possibility to dive a bit deeper, but I also have to disappoint Daniel a bit because I'm not going to talk too much about the MAF, so we might need to do that in the discussions later. But first of all, I really would like to basically pile on what my previous presenters have been saying already. I think the strategy that we're talking about, the chemical strategy for sustainability, is a really great step forward. It's really pushing the envelope. It touches upon a lot of issues that we are aware that need to be tackled in order to move towards a sustainable chemical use. So it was really actually fun to read that, and it's not often that you get that feeling when you read regulatory documents from Brussels. So thanks to everybody who was involved there. It's a really great piece of work. But that also sort of gives me the opportunity to dive a bit deeper in the issue that we're talking about today, and that is the mixtures. And I would like to basically take a closer look at three issues that I think need more work or specification or more thinking about. And that is the cumulative exposure that is still not accounted for. We still don't know really how to do that. It's the uneven consideration of different chemical groups, and it's the holistic perspective that we know that we need in order to tackle the mixture problem, which is still a bit underdeveloped, I would say. So when it comes to the cumulative exposure, I'm pointing to that because a chemical that you're combining with itself is perhaps the most simplest type of mixture that you can actually imagine. It doesn't really pose any scientific challenges. But the problem is the following. If we are just looking at how REACH is implemented, if we're looking, for example, at the guidance documents on information requirements, it very clearly states there that the registrant is not obliged to take into account the amount of chemicals produced by other registrants or importers. And that is, of course, a bit of a problem. So the idea behind that is that every registrant, every company has its own little environment for which they have to prove safe use. But that environment actually is not allowed to contain any other chemical or even the same chemical coming from another registrant. And that is a bit of a problem. Here's just one example. I just picked bisphenol A because the compound has been discussed so often, and it's still one of the fundamental base chemicals that we have. And if we're just looking at the number of registrants or suppliers of that chemical just from the ECHA database, then you start to looking at that, you continue to look at that, and you continue to look at that. And you end up with 64 companies that have registered to produce the chemical for different purposes, for the same purpose, but we have 64 registrants. We do not only have one emission source, but we have 64. And we simply do not know how the total exposure piles up in the end. So the conceptual picture within REACH is basically that we have one emission source, one consumer product, one activity, one company that is responsible for the emissions into the environment or into the human body. But the reality that we're facing for a lot of those chemicals is we have a lot of actors that are all producing the same chemical, and the emissions, the exposures are piling up, and we are not accounting for that at the moment. So again, this is the most simplest type of mixture that I can imagine. It's scientifically certainly not a challenge to just add the production and emission volumes, but it's something that is not actually done in practice, which leads obviously to a, say, misclassification or an underestimation of the overall risk that we have there. When we're looking at the chemical strategy and when we're looking at the annexes, I think Anna mentioned that, but also Urban, that we have a quite ambitious time plan there, which I think is good. It really moves things forward. So that's really good. The interesting thing is if we're really looking at the different chemicals and the different activities that are specifically mentioned here. So chemicals in water, food contact materials, food additives, toys, detergents, cosmetics are mentioned, and we see the corresponding regulations and directives on the right-hand side. Having been working with mixtures for a bit, it sort of becomes a bit obvious that there is one group of chemicals actually missing, and that is the pesticides. We know that we have a problem with pesticide mixtures. We have the best empirical data for all chemical groups for the pesticides, but they are not really listed here as an area in which action is going to happen soon. If we're looking into the chemical strategy directly, it basically, the pesticides are mentioned there. It mentions that for pesticides and biocides, legislation requires already to consider cumulative and synergistic effects. That's true. Those regulations are actually further ahead than a lot of the others. For pesticides, progress has been made in developing target methodology, and work will be accelerated so that existing provisions can be fully implemented. So there is work ongoing, and that will be speed up to actually implement the existing provisions. So let's just take a look at those existing provisions. Here is
Thomas, you have 1 minute left.
Here is the PPP regulation, and the PPP regulation clearly states that residues of pesticides shall not have any harmful effects on human health, taking into account known cumulative and synergistic effects. Great, that's exactly what we're aiming for. That's exactly what we need to have. The important issue here is that when we're looking at the environmental risk assessment of pesticides, we do not have that provision in there. Mixtures, cumulative effects, synergistic effects are not supposed to be taken into consideration, which basically means it doesn't help us to just implement existing provisions. We actually also need to expand here. Otherwise, we are losing the environmental compartment completely. Here's just one example of the pollution that we're finding in a small stream up in the northern part of Gothenburg that we have done. That's a study that we've done together with our colleagues from the UFZ in Leipzig, the Center for Environmental Research in Leipzig. And what I just want to point out is the first thing is, again, we are finding complex mixtures of chemicals. We find 84 chemicals in an ordinary average small stream. But only 37 of those are falling under REACH. The rest are, for example, pesticides, they are biocides, they are pharmaceuticals. And if we're looking at what's happening or what is written in that famous box in the chemical strategy, it specifically says to introduce a mixture assessment factor within REACH. So we need to really be careful that we're not overlooking more than 50% of the chemicals that we're dealing with. It's really problematic to just focus and just basically select half of the chemicals, especially because we know the other half, the biocides and the pesticides and the pharmaceuticals, are compounds that are made to be biologically active. So we can't afford to overlook them. The box continues to basically say that combination effects and other relevant legislation, such as the legislation on water, is supposed to be looked at, and provisions are introduced and reinforced. So we really need to see, how do we do that? How do we get that holistic view that we are really looking at all the chemicals that we are finding in an environmental compartment or in a human body? And I'm almost done. So basically, I really think the chemical strategy is a real step forward. So that is really, as Anna, I'm really excited to see that a lot of the critical issues when it comes to chemical use, to chemical production, are in there, it's really providing a good basis to move towards a sustainable chemical use, and that's where we want to go. But on the other hand, there are many devils in many details, and I've just tried to introduce 3 of them very briefly, and we need to make sure that we are accounting also for the details to implement things in a, say, long-term sustainable or sound way in order to really move things forward. And with that, I would like to finish. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Thomas. I will, before we go into the discussion, just let you reflect on the question from Karel. He asked if the mixture assessment factor could be something else than an arbitrary factor of 10 that you apply to kind of all chemicals, or is there something more advanced being discussed?
Well, there are two things there. The first thing, the whole idea with the mixture assessment factor or the mixture allocation factor is to have a simple tool that can be applied. As soon as we have the data and the possibilities to go deeper and to do a more detailed assessment and to account for different properties, etc., to do pharmacokinetic modeling and what have you, all those things that we like to do, as soon as we have the data for that, we should be doing that. But the idea with the mixture assessment factor or allocation factor is really to have a tool that can be applied in data poor situations. So I can understand that from a scientific perspective, oh, that's boring, that's just another factor. But that's exactly what we want. We want a boring tool that can be applied. But again, the big devil in a big detail is how big is that MAF going to be? And that has to be where it has to be anchored into science. Otherwise, we basically need to be sure that it is sufficiently protective, but not excessive. And to find the right balance there, that is going to be the challenge. So now it's really up to dig down into the details and to come up with some estimates there.
Okay, one more quick question, Thomas, from Eva Kumar. What kind of intermediate measures for risk assessment of mixtures will be taken before MAFs are introduced concretely, or maybe you can ask or answer to?
I don't think that I'm the right person to answer what will be implemented. That is a policy decision that depends a lot on what's happening both on the European level, but also in the individual member states. So that's perhaps more a question to Urban and colleagues. But of course, from a scientific perspective, we have the World Health Organization, where the first one who actually came up with a hierarchy of different tools and approaches within mixture assessment. And the next step after just introducing a MAF would be to apply concentration addition as a first, slightly more precise rule to actually get a better understanding of the risk of the mixture, of the compounds that are driving the risk, and where risk mitigation measures should be starting. And then if you still have more data, then you can go for more detailed interactive models and things like that.
Okay, thank you, Thomas. I will now ask Urban, Kristina, and Anna to turn on your cameras, and we will have a short discussion. There are not a lot of questions in the chat, so we will focus this discussion on implementation challenges of the strategy, as well as the role of research. There are quite a lot of researchers listening into this. But let's start on specific or major implementation challenges that you see in when it comes to I mean, we are focusing mainly on the mixtures, but you can also reflect, if you like, on the strategy as a whole. And I'll ask maybe Kristina to start.
I think what Thomas just lifted up, I think the big issue now in the implementation is to decide on which size we are going to use for this factor. And there was someone asking for intermediate measures, and that is also a bit challenging for for companies, because what companies need is predictability, that we know how we are going to risk assess, and that will not change with time. Because if you introduce sort of intermediate measures now, that will have an immediate effect on chemicals that are in the market. So if you say that you need to introduce an intermediate factor of 10, that will wipe out a large amount of chemicals from the market. And if you then, after some years, come up with, no, we can change this to 5, I mean, there is no way that we can take back what has been already removed. So that's why it's important for us to have a predictability, and that we have something that we know is valid today and that is valid also in 10 years, because it might take 10 years to actually develop new chemicals. So if you start today, you need to be somehow sure that you have the same rules in 10 years when you actually can put this new chemical on the market.
Okay, Anna, would you like to continue? And you can wave if you want to say something in the panel.
Yes, I can comment. I also agree that I think that, especially in this quite ambitious time frame of the chemical strategy, it would be difficult to introduce some intermediate measures. And but what is in place today is basically nothing. So this is really the first step to address unintentional mixtures. And I agree that it is a scientific decision with a mixture allocation factor, but I also think it's a policy decision, because I think it's simply not possible to set exact scientifically a mixture assessment factor that is always true for everything. And I really appreciate the inquiry done by Thomas and others in the FRAM Centre, and also you, Daniel, that was made for the Swedish government a year ago about how to tackle mixtures. And I think that there is already an evaluation of existing proposals and possible factors that can be used. But I agree that when we set them, they should be set. But it should not take 20 years because of that.
Okay, may I add a question to you, Urban? I'm thinking about the implementation of this strategy, and how much was this the work of the DG Environment, and how much was DG Growth into this? I assume that DG Growth is very important for the implementation of the strategy. And are there any particular discussions there around, for example, mixtures?
Well, I would say that clearly the environment was in the lead of the development of this strategy. You can also see that the pieces of legislation where the environment has the responsibility for the implementation together with the DG Grow, those are in the focus of the strategy, really. It's basically REACH and CLP, which is in the focus. Then when it comes to other pieces of legislation, other areas of use outside this area, where it might be, in some cases, DG Santé and who is in charge, like for pesticides and biocides or food contact materials, but also some pieces of legislation where the responsibilities with the grow, like toys. I would say there the measures, the actions introduced are less clear, and this is reflected in the strategy. Then of course it might be for other reasons that there is a lot to deal with, and REACH and CLP are the central pieces of legislation. So it's in that sense logical that you have a focus on those pieces, but I think this is part of the reason why pesticides, like also Thomas mentioned, are not very much mentioned in the strategy, there are at least few clear actions focusing on pesticides, for example. So I guess in some of these pieces also, in some of these areas in relation to mixtures, it's more remains to be discussed how to actually address it in these areas. When it comes to pesticides, Santé has, Santé together with EFSA has been developing this approach with the cumulative assessment groups for 10 years, and they are still not ready to use. So this is an example how tricky it is. And that also points to go for a simple and boring solution, like Thomas said, to go for the mixture assessment factor if we want to achieve something in a relatively close time frame.
Yeah, thank you, Urban. There are also some questions relating to specifically this issue. Isn't it too simplistic to have like just one factor, or other regulatory options, roughly summarized? Thomas.
Yeah, just one thing. Greg has just posted a link to the outcome of a workshop where the MAF was discussed in more detail. So I would really suggest that if you're interested in that, take a look at that report. The link is in the chat.
Thanks.
Andreas Fox in that case, and that links to your question, basically was asking whether an absolute number of a MAF does not lead to either an over or an underestimation of risk. And the answer is yes, it will. And we need to make sure that we are on the right side of things here. But the critical thing perhaps is also, and that is an important detail in that discussion, is whenever we are talking about an allocation factor or an assessment factor, this is the default. Which means as soon as you have more information, as soon as you have a better understanding of the pollution situation, the exposure scenario in a given river or something like that, you should always be free to say that, okay, this factor is far too big here, we need a smaller factor, or we can actually really predict and measure the toxicity of the mixture, so we do not need an assessment factor at all here, but you can go beyond that. So as soon as you have the data, you can actually start playing around with. Again, the challenge here is how to handle situations where we do not have those data. And then those factors are default. They are, as mentioned before, largely political in nature. We just need to make sure that they are sufficiently protective. That is the critical issue here. We need to make sure that we are not underestimating the consequences of mixed exposures. That's the critical issue.
Thank you, Thomas.
Yes. May I just while I have the microphone, so to speak, Andreas Kortenkamp asked the question in the chat, what about regulatory options other than MAFs, for example, group-wise limit values? That basically would be the same as having group-wise MAFs, and that is definitely another possibility. There are two challenges with that, of course. The one thing is, or the main challenge is, how do you define those groups? That's going to be the challenge. And again, as soon as we start doing that, we also need to be aware that those groups need to be defined in terms of toxicological, ecotoxicological, physical-chemical characteristics. So those groups will cross regulatory boundaries. And that is something which the current regulatory system, we don't have a mechanism on how to handle that.
Thank you, Thomas. So in the last 3 minutes, I will ask each of you to say something about the role of research for implementing this strategy. And if you have a particular research question, maybe you want to start this time, Urban.
Wow, you mean a particular research question related to mixtures?
Yeah, that could be it.
Well,
just one, please.
To answer. I mean, to me it seems, and here I guess science has a role, but my impression when looking into this area is that you have these huge knowledge gaps, and especially if you monitor chemicals in the environment, you find that only a small fraction of the chemicals you monitor you have any data about their toxicity, and there is also a lot of other factors that you miss, you don't know in many cases how much actually is put into the system, how much is produced, what the uses are, more precise, what the environmental fate is, where in what compartments these chemicals end up, how fast they are removed from the system. This whole area of knowledge is rather, I would guess there are studies, but there is a lot that remains to be done to get a better picture of the actual flow of chemicals into the environment and the resulting exposure. And of course, if it's even possible to go for a solution where you think you can fill these knowledge gaps, or if you need to take a modeling approach to make predictions in some way, that is something that I would want to know more about.
Yeah, thank you. I realized that this question I posed is like for another seminar series or something. But if Kristina or Anna wants to chip in with one very brief, like 15-second sentence on this, feel free.
Yeah, I just want to say that I think it's important to understand that we have different roles in this. You are experts in providing the floor and providing the knowledge. What we need are tools. So we need to transform the knowledge into tools that we can actually use to provide safe chemicals. So if we can cooperate more in tool development, I think that would be fantastic.
Okay, Anna.
Yeah, I think there are so many things you can do, but I certainly agree that we need to come into practice here, and scientists tend to, because that's your job, to focus on the things we don't know and what you want to do next. But I think you also need to be very clear on what we do know, and when there is an urgency, and where we know enough to act in the next steps as companies or as policymakers and so forth. But then, of course, keep filling the gaps.
Okay, thanks a lot. And thanks to all of you for your very good presentations. This strategy is something we will live with, I suppose, now for some time. So it was very good to have this as a kind of overview and initial discussion. Just as a final thing to say is that FRAM is planning its seminar series for the spring. The next seminar will be about water pollution from chemicals in Kenya, where we are currently working with the University of Nairobi on a case study. It will be January 21st, and I think this will be very, very interesting. So please join. And keep an eye on our webpage and our newsletter for more information about our seminars. And if you have suggestions, you're also welcome to email us and let us know of those. So with that, I will close the seminar and thank you all for participating. It was also very nice to see that we had, I think, 65 participants at the most, and we are still more than 50. So. With that, we'll close the seminar, and I wish you a good day. Thank you.